The gunman had already entered the store. 400 shoppers were trapped inside. Police were still 12 minutes away. But 68-year-old Walmart greeter Margaret saw something in the gunman's eyes that nobody else recognized. Because 25 years ago, Margaret had learned to read killers in a way that would save everyone. But first, she had to remember who she used to be before arthritis, and a walker made everyone think she was helpless. What happened next would either save 400 innocent people or make Margaret the first victim. But here's what nobody knew about the sweet grandmother who handed out shopping carts and smiled at customers. Margaret wasn't always a greeter. 30 years ago, she had made a promise that would explain everything about what happened in those terrifying 12 minutes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because what you're about to discover about Margaret Chen will change everything you think you know about heroes. Welcome to True Hero Stories, where the most extraordinary people are hiding behind the most ordinary smiles. I'm your host, and before I tell you how a 68-year-old woman with a walker stopped a mass shooting, you need to understand exactly who Margaret really was. Because without that knowledge, what she did next will seem impossible. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this story has a twist that will leave you speechless. And trust me, you won't see it coming. It was 10:47 a.m. on a busy Saturday morning at the Walmart Supercenter in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The store buzzed with weekend shoppers, families loading up on groceries, college students buying supplies, elderly couples slowly navigating wide aisles with their carts. The atmosphere was peaceful, ordinary, safe. Margaret Chen stood at her usual post by the entrance, her warm smile greeting every customer who walked through the automatic doors. At 68, with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a friendly grandmother earning a little extra income in retirement. But appearances can be deceiving. And what Margaret saw, walking through those doors at 10:47 a.m., made her blood run cold. It all started when Margaret noticed something in a young man's eyes that made her remember who she used to be. To understand what happened that Saturday morning, you need to know about the promise Margaret Chen made 30 years ago, a promise that had haunted her dreams and shaped every day of her retirement. Margaret hadn't always been a Walmart greeter. For 25 years, she had been Special Agent Margaret Chen, one of the FBI's most elite criminal profilers. She specialized in something that most people didn't even know existed, preventing mass violence before it started. Margaret's gift wasn't just understanding criminals, it was reading the specific psychological patterns that preceded mass attacks. She could identify potential shooters weeks before they acted, recognize the warning signs that others missed, and most importantly, she knew exactly how to intervene when violence was imminent. During her FBI career, Margaret had prevented 14 potential mass shootings. 14 times she had talked down armed individuals who had planned to kill dozens of innocent people. 14 times she had used psychology instead of weapons to save lives that would have been lost forever. But Margaret's career had ended abruptly in 1998 after a case that broke something inside her. A teenage gunman in Colorado had slipped through her profile, despite showing every warning sign Margaret had identified. 13 people died before police stopped him, and Margaret blamed herself for not seeing what she should have seen. The day after that tragedy, Margaret submitted her resignation and made a promise that would define the rest of her life. She would never again put herself in a position where her failure to act could cost innocent lives. For 25 years, Margaret had kept that promise. She moved to Cedar Falls, married a gentleman named Robert, and built a quiet life far from the darkness she had spent decades studying. When Robert passed away 3 years ago, Margaret took the greeter job at Walmart not because she needed the money, but because she needed the human connection. Every morning, Margaret arrived at 8 a.m. and positioned herself at the entrance, greeting customers with genuine warmth. It was simple work, peaceful work. The kind of job where the biggest crisis might be helping someone find the bathroom or dealing with a cranky customer who couldn't find a shopping cart. Margaret thought her days of confronting killers were over. She thought she had earned the right to spend her remaining years spreading small kindnesses instead of preventing large tragedies. She was wrong. Because on that Saturday morning, Everything Margaret had tried to leave behind, walked through the automatic doors of a suburban Walmart, carrying death in his eyes and a plan that would either succeed in the next 12 minutes or fail because of what a 68-year-old woman with a walker remembered about reading monsters. Saturday mornings at the Cedar Falls Walmart were always busy, but this particular Saturday felt different to Margaret from the moment she arrived at work. Nothing she could put her finger on, just a subtle tension in the air that her trained instincts recognized even after 25 years of retirement. Margaret had learned long ago to trust those instincts. During her FBI career, that indefinable sense of wrongness had saved more lives than all her psychological training combined. The feeling that something terrible was about to happen, often hours before any visible signs appeared. At 10:30 a.m., Margaret noticed a young man in the parking lot who triggered every alarm bell in her subconscious. He sat in a beat-up Honda Civic, staring at the store entrance with an intensity that most people would dismiss as ordinary impatience. But Margaret saw something else in his posture, in the way he gripped the steering wheel, in the mechanical precision of his breathing exercises. She had seen that exact combination of signs before, in case files that still gave her nightmares. The young man was approximately 23 years old, thin build, dark hair that needed cutting, wearing an oversized black hoodie despite the warm Iowa weather. But it wasn't his appearance that concerned Margaret, it was his behavior. The way he kept checking his watch, the systematic scan of the parking lot, the careful positioning of his car for a quick exit. Margaret's training kicked in automatically. She began what FBI profilers called a remote assessment, reading behavioral cues from a distance to determine threat level and intervention options. The young man's micro-expressions were textbook pre-attack anxiety. His breathing pattern suggested someone psyching himself up for violence. His positioning indicated tactical thinking that amateur killers often displayed in the minutes before they acted. But Margaret told herself she was being paranoid. 25 years of retirement didn't erase decades of training, and sometimes her mind saw threats that didn't exist. The young man was probably just nervous about a job interview, or psyching himself up to ask someone on a date, or dealing with any of the dozens of ordinary situations that might make a person sit in a parking lot and stare at a building. At 10:45 a.m., the young man got out of his car. Margaret watched him walk across the parking lot with the measured pace of someone following a rehearsed plan. His hands were shoved deep in his hoodie pockets, his head down but his eyes constantly scanning. When he reached the store entrance, he paused for exactly 5 seconds, long enough to take 3 deep breaths and steel himself for whatever came next. That's when Margaret saw his eyes clearly for the first time. They were the eyes of a killer. Not wild or crazy, but cold and determined. The eyes of someone who had already accepted that he was going to die today, which made him infinitely more dangerous than someone who still cared about survival. Margaret had seen those exact eyes in 14 case files. She knew what they meant, knew what came after that look, knew exactly how much time she had before this quiet Saturday morning turned into national tragedy. The young man walked through the automatic doors at exactly 10:47 a.m. Margaret Chen had approximately 12 minutes to remember how to save people's lives. The moment the young man entered the store, Margaret's 25 years of retirement disappeared like morning fog. Every instinct she had spent decades developing screamed the same warning: active shooter, imminent threat, hundreds of potential victims. But Margaret also knew something that nobody else in that store understood. The young man hadn't started shooting yet, which meant there was still a chance to stop him before he began. Margaret studied him with the clinical precision that had made her one of the FBI's most successful profilers. The oversized hoodie wasn't just for comfort, it was concealing something bulky strapped to his chest, probably a vest loaded with ammunition and possibly explosives. His right hand remained in his pocket, gripping what was almost certainly a weapon. His left hand hung loose but ready, the posture of someone prepared to draw a second weapon quickly. Most telling was his behavior pattern. He wasn't moving randomly through the store like a normal shopper. He was following a predetermined path, systematically scanning each aisle, counting people, identifying exit points. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spontaneous breakdown. This was a carefully planned mass killing, and the young man was in the final stages of execution. Margaret estimated approximately 400 people in the store, families with children, elderly couples, teenagers, store employees, all of them going about their normal Saturday routines, completely unaware that they had become unwilling participants in someone else's final act of violence. The nearest exit was 50 feet away, but Margaret knew that running would only ensure the massacre began immediately. The young man was positioned to see anyone leaving, and fleeing customers would trigger his attack sequence. Margaret's walker suddenly felt like an anchor. Her arthritis, which she managed with daily medication, chose that moment to flare in her knees and wrists. At 68, she was no longer the young agent who had once tackled armed suspects. She was a grandmother with limited mobility, facing someone who had probably planned for every contingency except an elderly greeter. But Margaret had something the young man couldn't plan for: 25 years of experience reading minds like his, understanding the psychology that drove people to choose mass violence, and most importantly, knowing exactly what psychological pressure points could stop a killer before he killed. Margaret made a decision that violated every personal promise she had made about avoiding danger. She began walking slowly toward the young man, using her walker to navigate between shopping carts and customers who had no idea they were about to become either victims or witnesses. As she approached, Margaret began doing what she did best: psychological assessment under extreme pressure. The young man's micro-expressions revealed crucial information about his mental state, his motivations, and his vulnerabilities. His breathing was controlled but elevated, nervous energy being managed through systematic exercises. His eye movements followed a search pattern that indicated he was looking for specific target types, probably authority figures or anyone who might pose a threat. His body language suggested he was operating on a timeline, checking his watch every 30 seconds. Most importantly, Margaret recognized signs of what profilers called suicide mission mentality, the psychological state of someone who had already accepted death and was focused only on maximizing damage before being stopped. But Margaret also saw something else, something that gave her hope. The young man's hands were shaking slightly, despite his controlled breathing. That tremor indicated internal conflict, doubt, fear, psychological cracks that a skilled profiler could exploit. Margaret positioned herself directly in his path and did something that would either save everyone in the store or ensure she became the first casualty. She smiled at him. "Good morning, sweetheart," Margaret said, her voice carrying the warmth she used with every customer, as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Beautiful Saturday, isn't it?" The young man stopped walking. His right hand tightened on whatever weapon he was gripping, but he didn't draw it. Instead, he stared at Margaret with confusion, as if her presence had broken the script he was following. Margaret had gambled correctly. Mass shooters typically planned for security guards, police officers, and potential heroes who might try to stop them. They didn't plan for friendly elderly greeters who treated them like ordinary customers. "I'm sorry, what?" the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret stepped closer, using her walker to close the distance while appearing non-threatening. She studied his face with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient, reading every micro-expression, every unconscious tell that revealed his mental state. What she saw confirmed her initial assessment, but also revealed something crucial. This young man was operating on a specific psychological trigger, and that trigger hadn't been pulled yet. He was in what profilers called the preparation phase, committed to violence, but still susceptible to intervention if approached correctly. "I said it's a beautiful Saturday," Margaret repeated, her tone gentle but direct. "Though you look like you're carrying some heavy thoughts, honey. Want to talk about it?" The young man's confusion deepened. Margaret could see him struggling to reconcile her friendliness with his expectations of how this moment should unfold. In his mental rehearsal of today's events, nobody was supposed to be kind to him. I don't," he stammered, then caught himself. "I need to go. I have things to do." Margaret recognized the language pattern immediately. Vague references to things to do or business to take care of were classic pre-attack verbal indicators. The young man was trying to maintain his psychological momentum while being thrown off balance by unexpected human connection. "What kind of things?" Margaret asked, stepping even closer. She was now within arm's reach, close enough to see the sweat on his forehead, the rapid pulse in his neck, the dilated pupils that indicated extreme stress. She was also close enough to see something else, tears building in his eyes. Margaret's profiler training identified what she was seeing. This wasn't a cold-blooded killer motivated by ideology or revenge. This was a deeply troubled young person who had reached a psychological breaking point and chosen violence as his final solution. Someone who could still be reached if approached with the right combination of empathy and authority. "Listen to me carefully," Margaret said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My name is Margaret, and I need you to know that whatever brought you here today, whatever you're planning to do, it doesn't have to happen. You still have choices." The young man's hand began shaking more violently in his pocket. "You don't understand. You don't know what—" "I know more than you think," Margaret interrupted gently. "I know you've been planning this for weeks. I know you chose today because it's busy, because there are families here, because you want maximum impact. I know you've written letters or made videos explaining your reasons. And I know that right now, part of you is hoping someone will give you a reason not to go through with this." The young man stared at her in shock. "How could you possibly—" "Because I've spent 25 years studying people exactly like you," Margaret said, "and I've learned something important. The people who plan violence like this, deep down, they don't really want to hurt others. They want their pain to stop. They want someone to see them, to understand them, to care enough to stop them." Margaret took another small step forward. "What's your name, honey?" The young man was crying now, tears streaming down his face even as his hand remained on his weapon. "David. David Morrison. David, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Whatever pain you're carrying, whatever has brought you to this moment, killing innocent people won't make it better. It will only create more pain, more families destroyed, more people carrying the same hopelessness that brought you here." David's breathing became ragged, the controlled pattern breaking down as internal conflict overwhelmed his psychological preparation. "You don't understand. Everyone here, they all have lives. They all have people who care about them. Nobody cares about me. Nobody would even notice if I disappeared." Margaret's heart broke for the young man, but her training kept her focused on the immediate goal, preventing violence. "David, I care. I'm here. I see you, and I'm telling you that your life has value. But more than that, I'm telling you that you have the power to choose something different right now." She gestured around the store with her free hand. "Look at these people, David. Really look at them. Families shopping together, elderly couples helping each other, teenagers laughing with friends. These aren't your enemies. They're just people trying to live their lives, just like you're trying to figure out how to live yours." David looked around the store, really seeing the people for the first time instead of viewing them as targets. Margaret could see the psychological shift happening in real time, the dehumanization that enabled mass violence beginning to crack under the weight of human connection. "I don't know how to stop," David whispered. "I don't know how to live with this pain anymore." "You stop by choosing to stop," Margaret said firmly. "Right here, right now, you make a different choice. You take your hand out of your pocket, you walk with me to a quiet place, and you let people help you find a better way to deal with whatever you're going through." For a moment that felt like an eternity. David Morrison stood at the crossroads between mass murder and redemption, while 400 innocent people continued shopping, completely unaware that their lives hung in the balance of one young man's decision. Margaret waited, using every ounce of patience and professional skill she possessed, knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether today ended in tragedy or triumph. David Morrison stood in the middle of Walmart, tears streaming down his face, his right hand still gripping the pistol in his hoodie pocket. Around them, Saturday shoppers continued their normal routines, a mother pushing a cart with 2 young children, an elderly man comparing prices on breakfast cereal, teenagers debating which brand of chips to buy. None of them knew they were living in the space between life and death. Their survival depended on a conversation between a 68-year-old greeter and a young man who had planned to kill them all. Margaret could see the war playing out in David's eyes, the suicide mission mentality battling against something she had awakened in him. Hope, maybe, or just basic human decency that his pain hadn't completely destroyed. "I brought everything," David whispered, his voice breaking. I have enough ammunition to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," Margaret said softly. "But David, having the tools to hurt people doesn't mean you have to use them. You still get to choose who you become in the next 5 minutes." Margaret's mind was racing through everything she knew about mass shooter psychology. David was in what profilers called the crisis decision point, the moment when years of psychological buildup either exploded into violence or collapsed into breakdown. How she handled the next few minutes would determine which direction he went. "Tell me about the pain," Margaret said. "What brought you here today?" David's composure cracked completely. "My girlfriend left me 3 months ago, said I was weird, said I creeped her out. My mom died last year and my dad doesn't return my calls. I lost my job at the computer store because I couldn't talk to customers. Everyone looks at me like I'm broken." Margaret recognized the classic pattern: social isolation, rejection, loss, and the gradual dehumanization that made violence seem like the only way to matter. But she also heard something else in David's voice. He was describing his pain to her, which meant part of him still wanted to be understood rather than feared. "David, all of those things are real pain, and I'm sorry you've been carrying them alone," Margaret said. "But look around. Do you see anyone in this store who has hurt you personally?" David's gaze swept across the families, the elderly couples, the store employees. "No," he admitted. "Then why punish them for pain that other people caused you?" "Because they don't see me," David said, his voice rising slightly. "None of them see me. I could disappear tomorrow and it wouldn't matter to anyone." "It would matter to me," Margaret said firmly. "David, I see you right now. I'm choosing to see you, to talk to you, to care about what happens to you. You matter to me." She paused, then added something that her FBI training had taught her was crucial in these situations. "But if you hurt these innocent people, you'll destroy the part of yourself that I care about. You'll become the monster that everyone fears instead of the person who deserves help." David was sobbing now, his psychological defenses completely broken down. "I don't know how to be anything else. I don't know how to matter except by making people afraid." "You matter because you're human," Margaret said. "You matter because you have thoughts and feelings and the capacity to choose love over hate. You matter because right now, in this moment, you have the power to save 400 lives, including your own." Margaret took one final step closer, now close enough to touch David if she needed to. "David, I'm going to ask you to do something very brave. I want you to slowly take your hand out of your pocket and show me that you're choosing to be the person I believe you can be." The store continued buzzing with normal Saturday activity around them. Children laughing, cash registers beeping, the distant sound of shopping carts rolling across linoleum. Life happening all around them while they stood in a bubble of crisis that would either resolve peacefully or explode into national headlines. David looked at Margaret for a long moment, studying her face. "You really were FBI." "For 25 years, Margaret confirmed, "and in all that time, I learned that the people who can be saved are the ones who are still capable of tears." "You're crying, David. That means you're still human. That means there's still hope." David Morrison slowly, carefully, pulled his right hand out of his hoodie pocket. It was empty. Margaret exhaled for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. "Where is it, David?" "In my car," he whispered. I couldn't bring myself to bring it inside. I sat in the parking lot for 2 hours trying to make myself get it, but I couldn't. I thought maybe if I came in without it, I'd find some other way to matter."